welcome everybody to Objective E about federalism in the American government and comparing that federalism to the system found in Europe. Let's go ahead and begin with the idea of just what is federalism. It is a way of organizing a nation so that two or more levels of government have authority over the land and the people. So in the United States, we do this by having a national government that we also call the federal government, as 50 state governments, as well as however many local governments, local being city, county, township, etc., etc. That is a federal system where power is divided between various levels of government. This has broad-ranging impacts on you, a few of them. First, you have to follow laws set by all these different levels of government, and states and local governments have to follow laws passed by the federal government. So everybody's following along here, and in the American system, the American government, the federal level of government, is generally supreme. You pay income taxes to both the national and state levels of government. There are military and police powers split between these different levels. So you see federalism in all kinds of ways all around you, so it is rather important to understand. Two views of federalism. One is known as dual federalism. Under a dual federal idea, the two parts of government are like a layer cake, where each layer of the cake is independent of the other one. Each layer has its own powers, its own responsibilities, etc., etc. They're dual. They don't really work together. So under a dual system, the states do their thing, the federal government does its thing, and there's not a lot of interplay. This was true in America. This was the system we followed in the United States until about the 1930s. With the New Deal, all of a sudden the federal government gets very involved in what the states are doing. So all of a sudden we move away from dual federalism and into a new era known as cooperative federalism. Here, if you want to keep with the cake analogy, which I think you should, the relationship is more like a marble cake, where you have the chocolate and vanilla layers all mixed in with one another, and it's one functioning cake or one functioning government. Each part needs the other part pretty much equally, and they have to cooperate to get things done. Now, in the American system, though the two layers are cooperating, the dominant partner is still the federal government. So the national government is still the one who tends to have the most important role in the government. Let's talk about the Constitution and federalism, because obviously if we're talking about government, we got to talk about the Constitution. The interesting thing about this is that there's not really any single part of the Constitution that deals with federalism. You'll remember that the United States, before the Constitution, had the Articles of Confederation, where the states were way too powerful. So in many ways, the Constitution as it is written is an attempt to get away from the errors of the Articles of Confederation. States are discussed in the Constitution, but the local governments are not. So a lot of what we figured out about the relationships between state and local and federal and local governments, we've figured out over time without a constitutional element. Now, Article 3, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerates the powers of Congress. This is a list of the powers of Congress. The last one is probably the most important. The last one is something known as the quote-unquote necessary and proper clause. This says that the Congress can do whatever it wants. It can make whatever law it wants if it needs to do this in order to carry out its other powers. This necessary and proper clause gives the federal government broad-ranging power over states and local governments, because this allows Congress to keep stretching its power in whenever it sees fit. This is coupled with the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 4 of the Constitution that says that the federal government is supreme. So whenever a state or local law contradicts federal law, the federal law automatically wins. That is the supremacy clause. So between the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, you see here that our federal system really means that the federal government, the national government, will have more power than the states. And again, this was done to correct the problems that we saw under the Articles of Confederation. 10th Amendment goes on to say that any power not given to the national government is reserved to the states. So here you see the flip side of the coin. The Constitution is written so that unless there's a power that is given to the national government, it is given to the states. So there are some discussions here about what states should do. Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10 specifically, says that the states don't have several powers, such as coining money, forming their own armies, things like that. Those were powers they had under the Articles of Confederation that were taken away under the Constitution. 14th Amendment goes forward from that and says that the power of the states over individual liberties is limited, meaning the states cannot violate the Bill of Rights in laws that they create because they are part of this federal system. And if you're going to be part of the federal system, if you're going to be part of the United States, you have to give people their rights as they are guaranteed under the federal Constitution. However, how this has come to be is that generally the line between the national and state governments aren't really clear. So there's oftentimes some degree of interpretation as to what the Constitution really says about what powers are reserved to each level of the government. Some powers, and this gets complicated, some powers are also considered concurrent. And on the right-hand column there, you see the concurrent powers, such as borrowing and spending money, chartering banks and corporations, collecting taxes, etc., etc. These are things both levels can do. So we have a complicated system. That's why the marble cake analogy works well. It's a system that's very blended into itself. And as such, there are a lot of conflicts potentially between the federal and state governments. Here you see a table. Now this table is also repeated for you on the last page of the notes. You may want to look at this from time to time. It gives you some powers that are granted by the Constitution to different levels of government and some powers that are denied by the Constitution to various levels of government. So here you can see how we've kind of decided who gets what in this federal system. Bringing us to our first question. After examining some of these powers denied to the government on different levels, answer the following. Why don't we allow states to coin their own money? By coin there, I mean to print their own money. Second, what is a title of nobility and why don't we allow them? Third, what is an advantage of having both the federal and state governments build roads? Take a moment, pause the video, answer that question, and when you are ready, return. And we're back. Now, let's spend a little time here talking about how federalism can be adapted, really. Now, there's two main alternatives to federalism. One is known as a unitary system. This is a very common system of government where there are no different levels. The central government runs everything and determines all the policies for the entire country. So great examples here are Britain, France, Japan, and then the other countries that you see listed there. So this means that in Britain, the federal government does things like set military policy, set tax rates, things like that. But then the federal government in Britain, the only government in Britain, the British government, will also do things like set housing policy for the city of London, They will set a curfew for teenagers in the cities of Britain. The federal government makes all the calls. There is no other layer of government. This has certain advantages. It's simpler, for one thing, and it allows people to always know who is in charge. However, this also means that if you as a citizen want to get in touch with your representative in your government, there's only one level to go to, and that's just the guys at the very top. So there are some benefits and drawbacks there. Now, another alternative is what we call a confederal system. Here, the local units of the government hold all of the power. The central government does not exist except as much as the local governments want it to. So when we had the Articles of Confederation, that was a confederal system. The states had all the power, the federal government had very little, and if the federal government wanted to do something, it had to have the states backing it up. Other examples are the European Union and the United Nations. If the member states of the EU or the UN don't want the EU or UN to exist, then it stops existing. So the European Union has all of these member states. They are all equal. No one's in charge of the EU except as much as they want to give power up to the organization, to the confederal system. Obviously, some drawbacks here are if you have a bunch of different countries or states or what have you under a system, there's going to be a lot of arguing and bickering. Also, it's unclear who sets policy for the entire organization. But confederal systems are oftentimes looked at as good ways to get a lot of people together under some kind of umbrella. So it is a good way to become more competitive, but it's not quite as good, generally speaking, as a federal system, such as what we have now in the United States. Leading us to our next question. What lessons should the EU take from our experience under a confederal system? Remember that when America was governed by the Articles of Confederation, we were a confederal system, just like the EU. What went wrong for us? Try to give our European Union friends some advice here on how they might avoid some of the mistakes that we made. Take a few moments, answer those questions, and when you're ready, go ahead and proceed. All right, now let's talk about how federalism works in practice. Congress has to make two decisions when it determines how to influence the states. First, will Congress be flexible or restrictive? Second, who pays? Who is going to own up and pay the money for whatever this new law is? Given these two decisions, you can see how federalism will end up impacting the states and how the decisions made at the top will impact the people. There are essentially four options for how Congress will interact with the states. Option one is no influence. So this is like a dual federalism system, like we discussed at the beginning of this presentation. Under a dual federal system, domestic policy is set by the state. Foreign policy and big policy decisions are decided by the federal government, but the states have a lot of power. States would decide things like how to treat racial minorities, how to define obscenity, how to decide what age you should allow people to drink alcohol, things like that. So option one, we don't see much anymore, for obvious reasons. When we had a dual federal system, you had states like Mississippi and Alabama running off and passing all kinds of Jim Crow laws restricting the rights of African Americans. You had states like Massachusetts defining obscenity very, very, very broadly, so that lots of things were considered obscene there that weren't considered obscene elsewhere. And you had all the states deciding different drinking ages. So you could drink at 18 in some states, 21 in other states, etc., etc. So the option 1 we don't see too much anymore for all of these obvious reasons. This brings us to option 2. Option 2 is what we call a categorical grant. Now, by grant here, I mean the federal government is going to give money to the states, but there is a catch. Congress will give policy instructions to the states. So Congress will say, what we want you to do is raise your drinking age to 21. Then if you do, we're going to give you money. This is done all the time in education, welfare, housing policy. State politicians hate this because they want that money. State politicians want those categorical grants, but they don't want to do what the federal government wants them to do. So they oftentimes balk at this idea of a categorical grant. And the categorical grant can be relatively unpopular, but if you want the states to do something, put it out there. Say, if you put out this new standardized test, make all your 10th graders take it, like the OGT, we'll give you $10 billion. Well, all of a sudden, that's a lot of money. State lawmakers love money. All lawmakers love money. They will do things in their state to get that money, like through a categorical grant. The next type of grant is far more popular with state-level legislatures. It is called a block grant. A block grant is less restrictive than a categorical grant. Here, the federal government will set a broad outline for a policy, then let the states have some latitude meaning some ability to define it themselves, in determining how to meet the requirements. State politicians like this because it gives them some more freedom, but usually federal politicians don't like this. Federal politicians find that when they give a block grant, some states will do what the federal government wants. Other states will kind of play the game, get the money, and then not really do what the federal government wants. So block grants tend to be a bit more controversial at the federal level, but more popular at the state level. This brings us to option 4. This is very unpopular at the state level, pretty popular at the federal level. This is unfunded mandates. This is simply when the federal government issues a mandate, passes a law, for example, but it doesn't offer them any money. So the federal government would just say, you need to raise your minimum wage to $8.15 an hour. State governments would say, hey, no, make us. The federal government would say, okay, if you don't, then you're going to be penalized. And the federal government can sue the state governments for not following through on the laws. Unfunded mandates tend to be very unpopular. But when the federal budget is looking tight and you want to get states to do something, sometimes this will still happen. State politicians hate this. This is their least favorite kind of mandate because this is just like your big brother coming into your bedroom, taking your stuff, rearranging your furniture, and saying, deal with it or I'll punch you, essentially. So unfunded mandates tend to not be very popular with the state level, but tend to be more popular with the federal government. Question. Summarize each of those 4 options, then say why each option might be controversial with different groups of people. Groups of people here being state lawmakers or federal lawmakers. Answer in a paragraph, take a moment, pause the video, then when you're ready, go ahead and resume. Alright, so now that we've learned about federalism, let's take a look at it from a pro-con argument. First, some advantages. Our federal system gives you access to different levels of government. So if you are unhappy with traffic laws in Euclid, you go to Euclid City Council. If you're unhappy with the military age, for the age you have to be to enter the military, you go to the federal government. You know what level of government does what. And that allows citizens to have access to a bunch of different politicians and in so doing allows us to have a more representative and active democracy. Also, this is one we don't talk about much. States can test out policies to see if they will work at the federal level. States end up being like little laboratories. So, for example, we will legalize marijuana in Colorado and Washington, for example, and then we will say, hey, how did that work out? And if it works out in Colorado, works out in Washington, then we might say the federal government might want to seek to do the same thing. Also, what this gives politicians and political organizations, it gives them multiple areas to succeed. So if you're not getting success trying to push your agenda at the federal level, you can go down to the state level and push it instead. This is what we've seen happen to gay marriage bans in the United States. A federal gay marriage ban will never work because it's not popular enough on the national level. But individual states did go ahead and ban marriages between gay people, and in so doing, the people that have been working against gay marriage for the past 30, 40 years, they can keep some of the country at least on their side, while not being able to really keep the entire country on their side. So this allows you to work at different levels of the government to make it do what you want. However, this comes with some disadvantages. First, sometimes we have government services duplicated between different levels, and this is very inefficient. For example, we have state highway patrol officers patrolling the highways in Euclid, Ohio. That's fine. But we also have Euclid City Police that will drive on those highways looking for criminals. We have Cuyahoga County sheriffs doing the same thing. So you have all these services that can be kind of duplicated, and that duplication costs money. Secondly, you can have states just outright defy the federal government, such as with the civil rights movement. This can cause major social trauma, major social conflict. If we had a unitary system like they have in Britain, the federal government just makes all the decisions. So there would be no Mississippi locking African American students out of universities. The federal government would have just fixed that. So that did set up some conflict. Also, you have state policies contradicting one another. Presently, the best example of that is with gay marriage, where in some states it is legal for gay people to be married and they have full rights. In other states, it is not legal. So if you move from a state where gay marriage is legal to a state where gay marriage is illegal, what does that mean? Are you now no longer married? So these contradictions raise troubling problems for society, but generally, most people feel that our federal system ends up being more of a strength than a weakness. Take a look at these. I've got two slides here with maps of the U.S. showing how different state policies impact people. These are state welfare benefits for a family of four for the month. You can see Ohio there is in red. The average family of four in 2002 in Ohio got about $300 a month. That is about mid-range. Now, if you look around, if you are up in Maine, you got $400. If you're in California, $510. If you're in Texas, a family of four in Texas only received $183 a month from the state of Texas. So here you see an example of how each state has individually interpreted welfare laws, and in so doing, you have a broad range of states with all kinds of different benefits. If you are a poorer family in the United States, you might want to take a look at a map like this and say, well, hey, California really pays pretty well, Texas really doesn't. Maybe I want to move to California. Take a look at a second slide here. This is spending on public education per pupil. Ohio there is right around the middle. The state of Ohio on your education spends, this was in 2002, spends $7,881 on your education per year. Not too bad. But then you start looking around a little bit. The dark green states, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, they spend over $11,000 per year per student. You might, as a parent, say, hey, New York's going to give my kid another $4,000 worth of education every year he or she is in public school. Not too shabby. I might move up there. You might want to look down at the bottom of the list. Utah, North Dakota, $4,800, $4,900. That's not much money. So states get to interpret federal law and set their own policies, and it has broad-ranging, far-reaching impacts on American citizens. Last question. Look at some of the issues that we face today. Which ones might be better addressed by the federal government? Which ones might be better addressed by the state government? Explain your reasoning in no less than a paragraph. You might want to pause the video. You might want to go back a few slides and take a look at things. And then when you're done, go ahead and wrap these notes up, and I'll see you in class. Thanks a lot.